I've had the opportunity of traveling for the last decade 9 different times in the Middle East, and have traveled extensively throughout the West Bank and Palestine, and also in surrounding countries in Lebanon and Syria and in Jordan. And in those experiences, I've really tried to not just have bump and run experiences where you bump shoulders with someone and run to the next place, but to really sit down and talk with people. So I've looked for opportunities to talk with Palestinians and with Israelis, with Hebron settlers, and with also members of Hamas, with Jews, with Muslims, and with Christians. My opportunity of really getting to know these people have led me to understanding them, and then wanting to say we really need peace and justice for everyone involved. And I remember one of the last days we were there, I asked the guide, I said, why are we not talking about the political reality? And his comment was, it's such a complex situation. It's too complex to really get involved. And when he said that, it immediately took me back to my childhood. I grew up in Chattanooga, Tennessee in the 1960s. Racial tension was tense at best. It was very difficult. Racial riots were taking place in the streets of Chattanooga every night. And I asked my dad that night, I said, Dad, what do you think we should do? What can we do? And he paused for a minute and he said, Ronald, he said, people are saying it's a complex situation. We really can't do anything. And I'm so thankful that my dad didn't cave in to that old, worn-out adage, it's too complex of a situation, we can't do anything. And so I determined that day, one of the last days there, that I had to come back and I had to learn more, because I knew that I couldn't simply stand on the sideline and do nothing because it was too complex of a situation. That day, indeed, has changed my life as I have learned more and have gotten more involved in this conflict. I think one of the greatest misconceptions today, particularly for us as Americans, is that we always have to be balanced, is that we really can't take sides. And I think there's a real problem with that, and it really paralyzes a lot of people. It takes me back again to growing up in Chattanooga. I'll never forget, it was a spring day in 1969 at Delwood Junior High School. I was in the 8th grade at the time. 6th-period gym class had just finished. And we were walking from the softball field, and we were walking back up to the gym, when suddenly 2 of my best friends, they broke out in one of those just blood-gushing, nose-bashing fights. And they were beating up on each other. A close call at third base had ended the game. And they had been bantering back and forth all the way up the hill, and suddenly the fight broke out. And, you know, I'm sure if we talk about it today, my friends and I, we still call it the fight. It's the fight. If we ask who started it, they're 2 narratives. They're 2 different stories. But that wasn't really the important question that day when that fight broke out. That day, I was faced with a moral and an ethical situation. What would I do? What would I do in that moment? You see, one of my friends was 5'6", 135 pounds, an incredible tennis player, but he was nothing in the weight room. My other friend, he was 5'11", he was 185 pounds. He was already one of those kind of chisel-chested guys who wrestled heavyweight for our high school wrestling team. Well, needless to say, my larger friend was just beating my smaller friend to a pulp. And in that moment, I was worried. My smaller friend was getting a few blows in, but my larger friend, I was worried that day that indeed he was going to do something permanently harmful to my smaller friend. I wish I had known then the words of Miroslav Volf when he says that neutrality is positively harmful. And also the comment of William Sloane Coffin, who says, not to take sides is to take sides with a stronger partner. That day in Chattanooga, I wish I had jumped in. I wish I had restrained the arm of my larger friend as he beat my smaller friend to pieces. But the most important question for me and I think for all of us, is will we jump in now? Will we be involved? We have two friends involved in this conflict. We have our Israeli friends and we have our Palestinian friends, and both are friends. We need to love both, we need to care both, and we need to support both. But when we see one of our friends doing harm to another friend, I think it's our moral and our ethical obligation to do something. We can't simply remain balanced. We've got to step in and say, enough is enough. Stop doing this to my other friend. And so I think a real misconception in this culture in which we live is we always have to be balanced. And what I would rather say is, let's always be fair. Let's always treat both sides of this conflict with the same love, with the same ethical and moral standards. But when we see one of our friends mistreating the other friend, I think it's our obligation to say, enough is enough. Stop it. I'd like to suggest that there is a real parallel between the civil rights movement in the U.S. in the 50s and the 60s and the ending of the occupation in Israel and in Palestine, particularly in the West Bank today. In the 1950s and 60s, I was born in Chattanooga, Tennessee. I grew up there. I know what it was like to live in the South. And growing up as a Presbyterian, I remember my Presbyterian pastor as he began to speak up on behalf of integration. And I remember the resistance that he got. And the resistance, it was from good Christian people, Presbyterians, lifelong followers of Jesus. And they were saying, no, you can't do that. And they were resisting the inbreaking of God, bringing about a new way of treating people fairly, kindly, justly. But the resistance didn't come from evil people. The resistance came from good people, people who were trying to live the Christian life. And the same thing is taking place in Israel today. The resistance to ending the occupation is not taking place by evil people. They're good people. They're moral people. They're people that are trying to follow their faith. They're simply trying to embrace, though, a lifestyle and a political system that is oppressive to other people. And so I think we need to realize that in the middle of this struggle, it's not good against evil. We basically have good people on both sides. We had good people on both sides of the civil rights situation in the South. And so I think there really is a parallel between the two. And I think what we have to do is to call the good people who are opposing or are standing and supporting the occupation today. And I think we have to call them to task and say, you're a good person, but there's a better way of living. I spent 2 months living in the Middle East. One of those months I actually lived at the Tantur Ecumenical Institute, which is south of Jerusalem. It overlooks the Bethlehem checkpoint. And I made it my point of trying to get to know people. And one person that I met in Bethlehem, Trey Halsey, actually is a Mennonite mission co-worker, living there at the time with his wife. And one Saturday, he invited me to basically see Bethlehem through the eyes of a person who lived there. And so we drove all around Bethlehem, and he showed me the growing number of settlements that were building up around Bethlehem and the frustration that people who live there really face on a daily basis. And in the process of spending that time together, he discovered my love for cooking. And he asked me if I would like to learn how to cook Palestinian food. And I said, I'd love to learn how to cook Palestinian food. And he said, well, there happens to be a Palestinian woman, Afaf is her name. She's an incredible cook. She's a gracious host. Let me see if she'll teach you how to cook. So I said, great. He called and he said, next Saturday, he said, come on over. And so I went through the checkpoint. I met Trey, and we went with Afaf, and we went shopping. We were looking for the little eggplants and that you can actually carve out and stuff inside, and the grape leaves. And we shopped everywhere. It was interesting to go into the market, and here were the halves of the beef and the lamb. And you placed your order, and the butcher simply cut a chunk and then trimmed it and ground it for you. We then went back to Afaf's house, and for the next 5 hours, we proceeded in preparing Sunday's meal that we would enjoy together, a family meal. And she began to explain this was what Palestinian life was like. It was living together with family and with friends. And an important part of that was working in the kitchen together. And so we talked all afternoon. Afaf has 5 children, and she told me all about her 5 children, her daughter that was about to get married. Interesting thing is I actually attended her daughter's wedding 2 weeks later. So this Palestinian Muslim inviting me, welcoming me into her home. Well, it wasn't long after hearing the story of her children that I said, well, tell me about your husband. And tears welled up in her eyes, and she said, my husband died 2 years ago. She said, let me tell you his story. She said he was 42 at the time, and he had a heart attack one Sunday afternoon. And she said, as soon as the heart attack started, she said, I put him in the car, and we drove immediately to the Bethlehem checkpoint that separates Bethlehem from Jerusalem. Our goal was to get him to the hospital in Jerusalem, the best hospital in the area, the hospital where all Israelis have the best world-class medical care. We were detained at the checkpoint for 2 hours, simply out of meanness on behalf of the IDF soldiers. When they finally let us through, when we finally got to the hospital, he was brain dead, and he died a week later. Life is dramatically different for a Palestinian and for an Israeli citizen. There's not equality of life. And it's this lack of equality and even this oppression that creates a growing frustration and anger on behalf of Palestinians. The amazing thing is that our Palestinian Christian brothers and sisters, even in the face of such oppression, even with anger inside, are willing to say the only option we have is to love and to resist this oppression with creative, nonviolent resistance. And that's the only thing we'll do.